All right. Did anyone have any questions or concerns about how the course is going or anything like that? I feel like it hasn't been. I haven't overloaded you with too much stuff. I try to make it so you can get out of it, sort of what you put into it. Right. For me, the meat of it is all this stuff to think about, thinking about history and all these concepts, and that's really what it's about. Uh, if you're engaged, then you're learning. Well, I guess I'll start then. Um, Nobody has any questions or concerns. So we are done with Descartes for now. I'm always too optimistic about how fast can get things done. We also missed a couple meetings, but I think we can get back on track. So I'd like to finish empiricism today if I can. The next week we'll do Immanuel Kant and we'll begin philosophy of mind. Okay? We were supposed to start philosophy of mind this week, but this happens every single semester. So let's do empiricism. Okay, so we've done rationalism, right? We looked at Plato specifically and Descartes, two good examples of rationalists. But around the time of Descartes, there were other rationalists as well. There were people like Leibniz. Remember Leibniz, who co-invented calculus? He was a philosopher. He was a rationalist philosopher. There was also the Dutch Jewish philosopher Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, who also was a rationalist. And so they share certain things in common, right? A big one being that you begin with certain intuitive truths that you simply can know to be true with complete certainty, and then you sort of deduce by using deductive reasoning and logic. You try to deduce all these other things from it, right? And we saw the way that Descartes tried to do that, coming up with this foundational truth that he knows he must exist, and then he can also know that God must exist, and then everything gets built on that. Right? Other rationalists have slightly different projects, but they'll do something similar to that. They'll start with certain intuitive truths, like in geometry, you have axioms, and then you derive all sorts of things from that. They do the same kind of thing. What unites them all is this idea that you can have knowledge, but hopefully not just sort of tautologist knowledge, like everything is identical with itself, which is not super helpful, but actual real knowledge of reality, the kind that philosophers have been after, right? It's the whole idea is that we're trying to figure out what this all is, how it all works, what's real, what's not real. The rationalists thought that the primary way to do that is with the power of reason, with the pure power of thinking. And so the sensory information that we gather about the world is sort of gets put on a second place at least, right? For Plato, the whole sensory world is just kind of a shadow world anyway. You might know things about it, but that's not really knowledge of reality in itself, ultimate reality, which is something much more stable, right? And for Descartes, you could know things about the physical world, but you have to be very careful, of course. And most importantly is still reason and logic and intuitive insights for Descartes. And a big theme is also innate ideas, right? Because I mean, look, if you could know the nature of reality just by thinking about it, well, then those ideas must somehow be accessible to your mind, but not through the senses. And so they must not be external to you. They must somehow be in your mind somehow, right? Descartes or Plato, had this mythological explanation. Maybe it's all maybe we're reincarnated or something. And then Descartes says it's just God that puts these ideas in our minds. Right? So the big theme there is innate ideas, knowledge through reason, through thinking, and the senses take a second place. They might not be important at all, or there's something to be overcome, but they're just not reliable for the rationalists, not for true knowledge of necessary truths. And that's why they like a priori truth, right? And they like truth to be necessary truth. Yeah. But now we're going to look at the British empiricists. The empiricists thought a little bit differently about things, and for whatever historical reasons, they were mostly the big ones are found in Ireland, Scotland, and England, right? So the British Isles, for some reason, and the Continentals are the ones that tend to be more rationalistic, right? And when we say rationalistic, it doesn't mean that the empiricists were not trying to be rational. They were. They were in general thought being rational and reasonable is good. They just disagreed with some of the main tenets of rationalism, right? They thought that knowledge actually is derived from experience. That's the best kind of knowledge there is. And we don't have innate ideas, right? So that's the main pushback there that we're going to get through from our three empiricists. And the three empiricists we're going to look at are John Locke. Oh, get my phone. John Locke, Bishop Berkeley, and David Hume. I'm not cheating on my phone. I know those. I'm trying to connect it to the slideshow so I can control it with my phone. Okay, I'm going to pause it for a second. Pause. Oh, the picture. Before I go into the actual picture, this is the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp by Rembrandt. So 17th century painting. And we're seeing some good empirical science, right? Believe it or not, throughout the ages, very few people have been willing to actually take apart a human body to see what it's really made of, right? So some ancient Greeks were willing to do that, but they didn't get very far, and the textbooks that were based on these early attempts at examining human anatomy, you know, what happened with everything else from the ancient world? Everyone just thought they had it all figured out. So people relied on these old books of taxonomy that were completely wrong, right? They were completely inaccurate. Now, suddenly, people were more willing to actually, you know, find out how the body works. And this is the perfect example where rationalism isn't going to cut it, right? I mean, if you want to know how the cardiovascular system works, how the heart is able to pump blood throughout the whole body, and how the lungs saturate the blood with oxygen, and that gets the liver to all the various cells in the body that need it. Yeah, there's old, well, the notes in the 17th century when people started once again really examining, or do you mean the ancient Greek ones? Both of them. They're all available, you know, to look and see what kind of work they did. Yeah, if that was your question. In both cases, yeah. I'm struggling to remember the famous Greek work. It's some, I can't remember it right now. But there are famous textbooks that were being used, but then people thought, well, you know, this sort of scientific revolution happened where people thought we can't just assume a priori that we know what the human body is like, and we also shouldn't just rely on these ancient authorities, you know, as people had been doing. That was a big trend in the scientific revolution, right? It was thinking for yourself, thinking independently. Don't just assume the ancients figured it all out. Do empirical research. Right? So here we're seeing an example of that. It was also difficult because how do you get a corpse to do work on, right? So we've touched on this before, but in Catholicism, the idea is that you cannot desecrate a corpse, right? You shouldn't do that because the body is going to be resurrected someday, so you don't want to mess with it. You should just leave bodies be. A lot of questioning from others. You mean, at what point? Do you mean like once people started doing all this kind of empirical research, overturning old ideas, but also being willing to use human bodies to do research? If that's what you meant, yeah, all those things would have had a pushback. You know, not everybody was into that. So they actually had to procure these bodies. They had to be bodies of criminals at the very least, right? Deceased criminals, so that we could learn something about bodies. But the point here is, right, this is this is pure empiricism, isn't it? I mean, you see everyone peering in, actually looking inside a body to see how it all works, and then systematically studying the nature of the human body. I mean, how in the world would you do that as a rationalist, right? Plato, Descartes, if they were pure rationalists, good luck trying to figure out a priori how the human body works. Right? It's not going to work. It simply does not. Right? So I thought the picture was appropriate. It's a perfect example of somewhere where empiricism is what's called for, right? Systematically gathering data through the senses to build up an overall picture of what's going on inside the human body, to see how all the different systems interact with one another. You need empiricism for that. Right? You need the testimony of the senses, as it is sometimes called. Pure rational thought is not going to cut it. Pure insight into your innate ideas is not going to cut it. Yeah. Now, of course, the a priori is still going to be involved, right? Because a big part of science is doing math, right? You write down all the data, but you've got all these figures, and you have to have mathematical calculations to make sense out of a lot of this stuff. So math is still going to be a part of it, and we did have to discover that a priori. So it's not as though all the a priori stuff is just useless. It is rather than, at the very least, when it comes to certain things, you cannot simply just sit behind your desk and think, I betcha the liver does this, No, you have to do some research, empirical research, right? So remember, empirical means through the senses. So through what you can see visually, through what you can hear, what you can touch, and so on. So the three main empiricists are Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. Okay? So we'll look at each of them. So let's start with John Locke. Now, is anyone familiar with John Locke in any different kind of context? Have you heard of him? American history is right. That's exactly what it's talking about. So John Locke was, he wasn't just into epistemology and metaphysics, but he also did, exactly. He also did political philosophy. And he was very influential on the founding fathers, right? So John Locke is an example of, that spirit of the scientific age of overturning old paradigms and looking forward to a new world, to a new way of doing things. John Locke was doing that. He was looking back at the old systems, all the imperialistic systems, all the royalty, all this stuff with a king at the top, this sort of very hierarchical structure, and the king at the top has this power because God gave him this power, and he's in that position because God meant him to be there, and you are to be a loyal subject to the king. It's sort of the same relationship that you're supposed to have to God. The king is almost like God's figurehead in the world. And this is how nations all over Europe are structured at this time. And John Locke is trying to analyze all this and trying to think about, because obviously he saw all the problems that this caused as well, right? All the religious wars and, all sorts of problems about class inequality. And it makes you wonder, why do we even have this authoritarian structure? Why do we even have this hierarchy? Why do we have government at all? What is it for? And Locke's answer was that government is really, we're not here to serve the government. We're not here to be loyal subjects to this grand institution up there. The government is here for the public good. The government is here to protect individual human rights. So the idea now becomes about the individual. So individualism is a big theme in the scientific revolution as well. Right? It's no longer just about an entire nation or an entire class or these class structures or these hierarchies. No, it's about the sacredness of the individual as an individual person who is worthy of dignity and respect, right? So the right to life, right? So it doesn't matter how powerful someone in power is. They don't just have the right to say, hey, you must die, right? They don't have that. They should not have that right. You have a right to your life. You have a right to property. Right? The king can't just come and take all your money away. Right? Not anyone remember the old Disney Robin Hood, right? That kind of a scenario where the king is just really a bad character, and all the authorities are just abusing their power and taking money from people, taking away their basic rights. Right? This is the kind of thing that John Locke was trying to fight against, and he said, no, the very nature of government ought to be to protect those things. And now that sounds so normal and natural to us. We take it for granted that people had to come up with this idea that's so natural and obvious to us now, but that it was not. Right? So it's very interesting to think about this kind of stuff. So his ideas, when by the time, so after the revolution, the American Revolution happened, and they did it, freedom, we are now our own independent sovereign nation. What are we going to do? How are we going to structure our government, our entire society? Are we just going to copy England and the rest of mainland Europe? We don't have to, right? It's very difficult to have a country change suddenly if everything's already in place. So it's more difficult to make these big transitions. But for America, it was a blank slate that they had, right? They could do anything. The revolution had already happened. There is no general power structure in place. So what do? They have to actually decide. For once, it wasn't just given to them by the previous generation. Right? It's so hard when all these social systems are in place. Then when you come in, when you're a new generation, how do you overturn everything? It's very hardly possible. But in the United States, because the revolution had just happened, it was a completely blank slate. They could do anything. So what did the founding fathers do? Well, they were all these kind of Enlightenment, scientific revolution thinkers themselves. Okay, so George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, all these people were very much into reading the philosophy at the time. Right, so they were into reading about these new ideas about political philosophy, and John Locke was huge in that. So here's a British philosopher who ironically ended up providing the foundation of the United States Constitution, this basic idea, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. And then it goes to talk about these basic rights that we have, and that governments are supposed to be there to protect those rights, and doing away with this whole the idea of a king, right, of a God-appointed king. Instead of a God-appointed king, it's a people-appointed king. Right? It's individuals themselves that are able to determine who's going to be in charge. Now, of course, you can have all sorts of critiques about the way that actually happened, right? Especially then, right? Who actually had the right to life and property and freedom at that time? Well, it was mostly the white men that were able to get that, right? So it was not consistently applied, but as ideals, they are the very ideals that eventually then led to civil rights movements and stuff like that, right? They appeal to these basic core moral political principles to show that slavery, for example, is not compatible with that. Okay, so I just want that does not really have anything to do with our main history survey about epistemology and all that. But I just thought it was worth mentioning that, these philosophers, they're not always just in the ivory tower discussing abstract stuff. They are doing that, but in this case, you've got somebody who's thinking philosophically, whose written work actually had a huge impact on the founding of a nation, right? And so this is where you live, right? So you can trace the structure of this government and everything directly to someone like John Locke. But let's focus on his epistemology, okay? His theory of ideas. So when we say idea, don't necessarily think of your everyday idea of idea, your everyday concept of idea. For Locke, idea encapsulates a lot of things. It's anything that appears in the mind. So in this way, and in many other ways, Locke is almost exactly like Descartes. Okay, let me say that again. Locke is incredibly influenced by Rene Descartes' work and takes many of the elements that Descartes puts forward, and he takes them as basic and correct and true. But then, of course, Locke is an empiricist rather than a rationalist. So he's going to disagree with Descartes on certain key points. But in many ways, he takes a lot of Descartes' philosophy on board. And that includes this idea of talking about ideas or thinking as anything that appears in the mind. Any kind of thought that you might have, any kind of sensation that you might have, any perception that you might have, these all count as ideas. Okay? So that's just like Descartes' definition of an idea. So if you look at the little, this little thing right here, right? If you look out the window and you see a tree, your experience of that tree is an idea, right? So I'm just giving you the way in which Locke is using this word idea, right? When you have a perception of a tree, you are having an idea of a tree. And notice, is your perception of the tree the same thing as the tree itself? The answer I'm fishing for is no, right? I mean, you could imagine the tree existing, but you are not having a perception of it at this moment. That means the tree is one thing. Then now the tree comes into view, you see the tree. Now there's the tree, and there's a perception. There are two things there, right? There's a tree and your idea of the tree, which is your perception. And that's something in your head, in your mind. Remember how Descartes said, you can know that you're having a perception, even if you don't know that anything corresponds to it out in the real world out there, right? So you can know that you're seeing a tree. You know you're having a perception of a tree. That doesn't mean there really is a tree out there, right? They're two separate things. There's a thing out there in the world, and there's the idea in your head. When you're having a perception of a tree, what you are really having an experience of is something internal that represents something outside. Right? Same thing if you're thinking about a triangle. Right? I've had you think about triangles quite a bit in this class. So anytime you're doing that, you're entertaining ideas, right? Ideas in this very broad, general sense of the term. Thinking about a triangle, thinking about a unicorn, just imagining stuff that counts as having ideas. Right? Having a thought that it's raining. You're just thinking to yourself, oh, it's raining outside. That's having an idea. Experiencing the smell of coffee. Let me see, do I have oh yeah, I just had coffee in here, right? So there's some coffee in there. Remember the objective world out there. It's just extended stuff. But if I go like this, then I can induce in myself an experience of coffee smell. That's in my head. It's not out there. Out there, it's just these little smell particles, right, that induce in me the experience of the smell of coffee. Those are all ideas. Right? So we're just starting here. This is basically just a definitional thing. This is not really a theory yet. It's just saying, well, this is what I mean by idea. Just anything that can come up in your mind. So that means perceptions, imaginations, thoughts, memories. And the idea is, Locke's argument is, there are no innate ideas. You're not born with any sort of knowledge in your mind just ready to be unlocked, as we saw in Plato and Descartes, and as you would see in other rationalists like Leibniz and Spinoza. That I usually skip over them because there's too much material. We're born with sort of a blank slate. This is how Locke views it. That when a baby is born into the world, they don't in fact already know the Pythagorean theorem, right? Now, even Plato and Descartes would agree that they don't know it in a conscious way, but they would say that the idea is already in your mind somewhere. You just have to unlock it or get at it somehow, right? But Locke is denying that. Locke would say there's no sense in which the Pythagorean theorem is already in your mind. There is no sense in which the idea that God exists is already in your mind. There is no sense in which 1 plus 1 equals 2 is already in your mind. Those things are all learned through experience, right? They are learned about the external world. You're not learning something about what already exists in your mind. You're learning about the external world, and that has to be through the senses. So when you're born into the world, you're this blank slate, and you're just waiting for life to write on you with its crayons, right? You need experience to start having stuff on that blank slate. So now, of course, you're not a blank slate. Now you've got all these ideas in your head. But that's only because you had a bunch of experience. If you didn't, you'd still be a blank slate. We get all our ideas through experience. So this is a quote from Locke. I'll just paraphrase it. Easier to do. It's through experience that you get all your knowledge. And ultimately, all knowledge is derived from experience. It might get really abstract, but it's ultimately traced back to experience. So we have observations, right, experience, either about stuff around us, around the world, the physical world around us, coffee cups, trees, and all that, or you can have experience of your own mind, right? When you're just perceiving your own thought processes and reflecting on them. Those are the two sources of knowledge. They both involve experience. One is experience of the external world. The other is experience of the internal world. In both cases, it's external or experience. And that's where all knowledge is derived from, right? So take a moment to think about that. External world, that's easy, right? He's saying, if you don't want to know what the world is like, open your eyes and look, right? If you want to know about the external world. And aside from that, you can also just sort of sit there and close your eyes and do this kind of a priori thing of just sitting. But what you're doing is you're having a kind of internal experience rather than an external experience. So you can think about how your mind works and what kinds of patterns your mind follows and things like that, but that is still going to count as experience. Right? So you can use your outer sense to learn about the world around you, but you also have something called an inner sense. And I mean, you could do this very simply. If you think of a basic meditation exercise, you can do that, right? It's a meditation exercise. They'll have you do that. Kind of close your eyes. Try not to think about a bunch of stuff. Try not to necessarily look at everything around you. Try to just observe the flow of experiences going through you. How do you do this? Well, you've got some sort of inner sense, right, that allows you to simply observe the stream of experiences that is going through your mind. And you can even observe your thoughts passing through, right? In meditation exercises, they'll say, oh, you can think stuff, that's okay, but observe the thoughts floating by, right? Yeah, you can do that sort of thing, can't you? Locke calls this your inner sense. Part of this idea of experiencing the outer world, the way we have it set up, and what I already mentioned is, strictly speaking, when you're having an experience, you're just having the experience. The experience might have been caused by a thing out there in the world, but it's not the same thing, right? So you experience is a representation in your own mind of the world out there. We experience representations of the external world. So sometimes this view is called representationalism. It's a very difficult to not agree with it if you think about it, but it also creates all sorts of difficult problems. Let's see if can we know? I'm not sure what you mean, Parker. There's no innate ideas. Does that imply that we can measure ideas? You mean like Right. So you start with no ideas, but then the psychology of it would be that first you're just a baby, right? You can't think abstractly yet. So the idea is that you get all this stuff sort of imprinted on you, and then eventually, now this is the tricky part, and maybe you're pointing to this. Then eventually you start to see patterns. Okay, um, so eventually you learn, right? So something like a baby touching a hot oven, right? A child touches a hot oven. They don't know that it's going to be hot. Then they have that experience, they experience the pain, and they seek to avoid pain. So then you learn, avoid that thing over there, right? So you sort of get the ball rolling. Yeah, but now I'm not sure exactly what you're asking still, but you might be zeroing in on something that's a problem, which is that if your mind has no innate structure at all, then how can you get all this writing on that chalkboard, all the writing on the slate? How do you ever organize that into something coherent if there is no internal structure to the mind? If that's what you're getting at, yes, and that's something that Kant is going to address, and that's something that modern neuroscience addresses as well. So it can't be that, yes, it can't be that your mind is just completely structureless and featureless, right? There must be some way that your mind is able to take in all this data and form something coherent out of it. But Locke is not really addressing that. I think what Locke is more worried about is certain propositions, right? Certain things like a squared plus b squared equals c squared, or God exists, or anything like that, where it's a statement that's true or false, and that you know that it's true or false, right? Those are the kinds of ideas he's talking about. He's not really talking about innate capacities or mental structures that need to be there in order to get any kind of experience at all. That's Kant is really going to address this glaring omission in this whole theory, right? Um, yeah. So there is that. If that's anything near to what you were worried about, there is that to worry about. Yes. Yeah. But the main thing here that we don't have to dismiss everything Locke is saying, because what he is simply saying is all that stuff that we've learned through science and through geometry and through math and through logic, all these best examples that we have of knowledge are things that we would never know without experience. And it's only through experience that we can get the ball rolling. Right? So even math, for example, in order to build this kind of system, you have to first have all sorts of experiences, immediate felt experiences, that then over time you can abstract from those and build elaborate abstract systems. But it all starts with experience. Okay, so yeah, so we went on a little detour there, and that's good, and we will come back to it, right? This is a big thing that Kant is going to address. Okay, so for now, all we need to say is Locke is saying Pythagorean theorem, for example, that it does not make sense to say that that's somehow in your mind already, and you just have to unlock it. No, it's not like that. You have to have all sorts of experiences first before you can know something like that. And that goes for all knowledge of truth. Any kind of knowledge that we have about the world has to ultimately be grounded in experience of some sort, sensory experience. But part of this is this representationalism. This is what I was getting at. Right. So I'm doing it like this. Imagine that there's really a fire hydrant out there. When you're seeing a fire hydrant, what's really happening, and this picture is based a lot on the work that Descartes had done in optics, right? In the way that light and eyes and vision work. What's really happening is that there's an object out there, and that object is causing you to have an experience. The experience is not the object. The experience is something that's internal to your mind on this view. All these things can be pushed back on, okay? But I like to just motivate it so you see why philosophers are worried about these things. Because on the one hand, this does seem kind of right and obvious. That on the one hand there's an object, and on the other hand there's my experience of an object, and they're not the same. On the other hand, this leads to all sorts of problems. Problems about skepticism that we already looked at earlier, right? That if it's possible that you're having this experience, and your experience is not necessarily the same as the thing out there, right? You can see how this causes problems. But if we're not worried about those sort of cases, in an ordinary way of thinking about things, you could simply say, yeah, when you see objects in the world, what's happening is that light is reflecting off of them, and it's causing you, because of this bombardment of photons in the back of your eyeball, and your brain turning that into a visual representation, then you have the experience of the fire hydrant or the experience of the tree, or whatever it is. But it's all completely dependent on this whole causal story of the object out there, and then it's causing you to have these experiences in your mind of this external object. And the whole idea is that that object out there is purely extended, right? Again, he's taking this all from Descartes. The object out there has extension in space, but it has no color really. So I kind of cheated by making it gray. But really, the object itself out there, the objective object in the world, doesn't really have color at all. It only has extension, and it has, surface, a certain kind of reflective surface, and it's because of the nature of that reflective surface that light gets dispersed in a certain way, and that gets interpreted as red by your brain. So you have this red experience. Your mind is sort of painting, right? It's making a painting for you, where reality itself is not colored at all. It is purely extended stuff. And there's just all sorts of weird, crazy phenomena going on, like light waves reflecting off that surface and then going into your eyeballs, and again, your brain then interprets that signal, which after all, where's the red in that signal? Where's the red in the signal that goes in the back of your eyeball? The red is not traveling through the air, right? There's no red anywhere there. All there is out here is some sort of light wave that we can describe mathematically without reference to color at all. It's only at the end result of a human being that we sort of come up with these colors in order to allow us to navigate this very strange reality out there. This strange reality out there, we can only know that through physics and through science. And to do that, we have to get rid of all these subjective elements like color and smell. Yeah, there's never a true representation of an object, given how many different ways an object can be experienced. Yeah, and Immanuel Kant is going to take this to the next logical conclusion and say, by definition, all you ever know are your experiences. You can't ever access objective reality directly. Because in order to perceive anything at all, your mind has to have a certain structure that allows for perception, and so the end result that you perceive is going to be mind dependent. Right? There's always going to be a subjective element to your own perception on that view. Now we'll get back to this representationalist idea, okay? But just remember, right? The world out there is a world described by physics. It's just matter in motion. Colorless, odorless, soundless, just bits of matter interacting with one another. Some of these bits of matter that interact with one another and us causes us to have experiences. These experiences allow us to somehow navigate the world, but we should not think that our experiences match what's out there. There is no redness out there. There's no correspondence between my experience of red and redness out there. Of course, this is not to say that it's not informative to know that something is red rather than blue, right? So all we really know then, of course, is that object has a certain reflective property on its surface, and that one has a different one. So we are getting to know that there's a difference between these objects, and that's good to know, right? If you look at this in an evolutionary kind of way, well, it's good to be able to tell the red snakes from the green snakes if the red ones are poisonous, right? Now, are they really red? No, they have a certain their skin has a certain surface that disperses the light in such a way that it induces into you red experience. And that snake has a slightly different skin surface with a different reflective property so that when light bounces off it and goes into your eyeball, you have an experience of blue. So it's informative. We are really tracking something that's out there in reality, right? So I want to make that clear. We're not claiming here that it's all just some sort of illusion, or that it's not doing any good for you. No, you're tracking realities, right? There is a difference between a red snake and a blue snake, and it's helpful to know that. But the snake itself is not truly red the way that you experience red as this sensation. Right? The snake itself is just an extended object. It's not even black or white or gray, right? That's why I cheated with the fire hydrant. You have to understand reality in this way that these early scientists were saying, and the way that they set up the whole scientific revolution, is you have to just be able to describe it purely mathematically, right? You can just describe its structure. Right? You can describe where all its different parts are and how they interact. You can describe how much it weighs because you could put it on another object and you can measure it. You can do all this sort of stuff, but none of that will involve any kind of reference to this sensation of redness that you have when you see a red object. Right? That is just not part of the scientific story. Right? So again, so you can see how Locke, again, is so much like Descartes. He's even a dualist like Descartes, right? And we can see this dualism, just drawing this line between your internal representations and then the external world out there. The real world out there, you can only know it mathematically. Your experience of red is purely in your mind. It does track something out there, but if you want to really know what's out there, you have to use the language of mathematics. Because the language of mathematics is what allows us to describe extended objects, right? We can measure them, see how they interact, see how they move. We can use calculus, right, to track the movement of an object over time and space. That's what science is all about. Okay, now, so he's got this basic theory of ideas, right? We get these ideas through experience. We get all sorts of experiences that put things in our mind, that impinge on our minds and create all sorts of things there to think about. Right? We're starting to fill up our slates with all sorts of stuff. But then once you start filling up that slate, once you have some basic ideas, you can begin to combine ideas, for example. Right? So you can make complex ideas. Right? We talked about the idea of a bachelor, for example. Right? A bachelor is a complex concept. It involves several things, like being unmarried, being male, being an adult. But you start with simple ideas. You start with just direct experiences that can't be broken down any further, like just the experience of white, right? Some white object, or a hot object. And before you can ever know what whiteness is in general or what heat is, you have to have some sort of experience. Right? In order to learn what round is, you have to see round objects. So you start with these very basic kinds of experiences that, yeah, a child would have these kinds of basic experiences first. Right? And that's why children learn very simple concepts first. But then you can actually take some of those simple elements and do things with them, right? You can take those simple elements and put them together in various ways. So you could, for example, you could just create a brand new concept. I just thought of this, wound, W-H-O-U-N-D. I just made up a concept, wound. It means white and round, right? So I started out with experiences. And then I was able to put a concept to these experiences. I experienced white things and I experienced round things. But now I can create a brand new concept. Right? Woundness. So I've created this brand new concept, but all I've really done is put together some old concepts, some more simple complex concepts. Yeah, wound golf ball. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Golf balls are wound, right? You can also start having other complex ideas, like you can compare two things with one another. And then you can get a more abstract idea of relative size, right? You can look at two objects and realize that one is bigger than the other. Right? You first have the experience of the objects themselves, and then you can compare them. You do more complex things. Or eventually, if you see enough white things, you can do this thing that Plato would talk about, right? You start grasping the essence of it. You start to have an abstract concept of it rather than just individuals all the time. Right? So, for example, to bring back cats again, at first, a child will have experience of cats, and they will just know individual cats, but it takes a little bit to figure out what is and isn't a cat, right? So at first they might see a small puppy and think it's a cat or something like that. But over time, they get sort of a paradigm or a prototype of what a cat is. You have an abstract concept, and now it becomes much more easy to tell ahead of time, oh, well, that's a cat and that is not, right? So over time, these simple ideas that we have can become more complex. It's really pretty straightforward, but it is kind of proto-psychology, right? Not a lot of people were working on this kind of stuff yet. Remember, this is like 17th century. Yeah, 18th century. 17th and the 18th century. Yeah. But for Locke, right, this is kind of a proto-psychology. He's looking at, and he's kind of doing this, ironically, in an a priori way, right? He's not actually doing this like psychological, scientific psychology would do. But a lot of psychology is a priori anyway. Okay. And this thing that I mentioned, right? And I have not used this terminology yet, so let me explain this. We experience things in the physical world, right? We have these experiences that I was talking about, right? A tree can cause you to have an experience of what you call a tree, and it'll look green and stuff like that. Locke explains this in what he calls, in terms of what he calls primary qualities and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are those extension-related concepts that Descartes talked about. Size, mass, location, right? Those are the primary qualities that objects in the world out there have. But they also have secondary qualities, right? So we can talk about the snakes in terms of their primary qualities. We can describe them using the language of mathematics, and we can look at the surface of the snake and how the light waves get bounced off. We can do all the science. But then also, snakes have this ability, if it's a red snake, right, a surface that is such that when light gets reflected, it causes us to have a red experience, right? That's also a quality that these objects around us have, right? This object over there can induce in me a green experience. That one over there can give me a red experience. Well, that's something about them. That's something that marks them as different. And yet, the redness and the greenness is not really out there in the object. It's not really out there, right? What it has is the ability to cause in us these kinds of experiences. You might think of another kind of example. Think of you're walking, and suddenly in your path you see a vicious, hungry-looking mountain lion, and you get scared. Now, that feeling of fear, that's completely in your mind, right? That's complete, or in your body, however you want to say it. You are having this experience of fear that was induced by the mountain lion. But there's no sort of fear in the mountain lion that it's throwing at you, right? No, it's just the mountain lion is what it is. It happens to induce in human beings the feeling of fear. Right? So fear in that sense would be a secondary quality that the mountain lion has. It just happens to have the ability to affect human beings in that way. But it doesn't really tell us anything about the structure of a mountain lion, or what it looks like and how it works, what its physiology is, what its history is. All the sciencey kind of stuff has nothing to do with fear, right? Fear is just our human reaction to that thing out there. The same idea applies to something like color. Right? That's just our reaction that we have to the objects out there, but the objects themselves don't really have color in the same way that mountain lions don't have fear that they're transferring to you. Right? The mountain lions are what they are. That's just our reaction to them. Right? So this is the kind of picture that you get. So this is all Descartes still. Right? Locke got all this from Descartes, basically. I mean, he worked on this, he developed this. The theory of ideas that we just looked at, not quite, but this, the idea of primary and secondary qualities, we got this from Descartes. And of course, Descartes got this from earlier people like Galileo, okay, who already suggested this sort of thing. So weird, right? Now, because notice what this means. There's very little on this view in your everyday experience that's really, really out there, right? That's objectively actually out there. Color, sound, taste, smell. Those things are not properties of the real world. The real world has certain properties like extension, size, shape, location, motion, rest, all that stuff. And some of those are able to induce in you the experience of a color, the experience of a sound or a smell. Deep sea fish being completely blind. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Let me see. Yeah, right. So other animals get around the world with a different kind of apparatus. Right? So I don't know what it's like to be a deep sea fish or any other creature for that matter, but you can imagine that the world looks very different to them. I mean, imagine creatures that can see different frequencies of light. Right? Imagine how that would change your perception of the world around you. And so you can begin to see that part is kind of subjective, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's true, right? You could identify the same object, but maybe through different ways. You could imagine that light waves might get translated by some animal brains as something completely different. And we get something like synesthesia sometimes, right? Where the senses kind of switch, right? So you could imagine that instead of seeing color, we smelled color. That whenever you have an experience of a red object, you don't see redness, you have some sort of smell, some sort of olfactory experience, which would still allow us to navigate the world, right? So it's not that we're completely cut off from the external world in this view. It's just rather, it's like what Descartes was saying. We have some fuzzy concepts that are just an artifact of our subjective finite minds. If we want to know what the real objective world out there is like, you got to ignore those and look for the real properties: extension, size, location, motion, rest. Those are the things you can study and measure with mathematics. So it's a little bit like the taste of music. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can imagine senses being switched around in that way, right? And that drives home the point that those kinds of experiences are mind dependent to a large extent, right? Now, of course, the world does provide an input, right? It does. So it's not as though we're completely cut off from the world. Our sense of smell, for example, look, maybe smell is easier than sound to convince you. Do you think that smell is really out there in the object? Right? Smelly milk, for example, versus non-smelly milk. Well, what is happening is different kinds of molecules are coming out, right? There's chemical processes happen. This milk is spoiled, and now different kinds of molecules are coming out and hitting your nose. It's just a different pattern, right? Now, it's good for us to be able to tell the difference between the two. One has this gross smell. Well, that signals to us, don't drink that. Right? It's a good thing that we can use our smell to be able to detect real differences in the objective world, right? So again, saying it's all in your head is not necessarily to say that you're living in an illusion or that it's all pointless to have color experience or sight experiences and sound experiences. It allows you to track reality to some extent, so we can tell the difference between spoiled milk and non-spoiled milk. But what's really objectively going on there is just a bunch of chemicals coming out, and all those chemicals can be described completely mathematically without any kind of reference to how yucky they smell to us. Right? Its yuckiness is not something that's inherent to the object, just like the scariness of a mountain lion is not something inherent to the mountain lion, but it's something that we bring to the table. Same goes for all your sensory experiences. Okay? They are what allow us to navigate this colorless, odorless world, in a very efficient way. It's sort of like shortcuts. It just allows us to map this overwhelming reality with these different kinds of categories. Yeah. I mean, what would it be like for it to not be like that? Right? How else would you experience things? Right? Okay, so whether you agree with this picture or not, I hope you understand what motivates the picture. On the one hand, there's sort of an intuitive argument for it, I think, right? Especially if you talk about things like taste and smell, I think people have an easier time. Tactile sensation is another good one, right? When you touch fire, to go back to that example, that experience of pain, that's something quite different from the molecules that are causing that pain. Right? So that's why we now scientifically, the definition of temperature has nothing to do with what we feel it to be. Right? Hot, cold, those are very relative terms that have to do with how we're perceiving stuff out there. If you want to measure scientifically what is happening, you have to look at the mean kinetic energy or something like that, the molecular energy that's being produced. You have to talk to an actual scientist about that. But that's what you would talk about. The painfulness of fire is not in the fire. Right? That's just something that you're experiencing as a result of the fire. Out there, it's just a bunch of molecules in motion that happen to affect you in that way. Yeah. Same thing with all your senses, sensory information. It tells you something about the external world, but to truly know what the external world is like, you'd have to focus in on these primary qualities, these things that are amenable to scientific investigation. Right. So whether this is just because it's intuitively true, then we should believe it, or maybe it's interesting to think about science as sort of, it's an old metaphor that not everyone will get right away. I didn't get it right away, but over time it made more sense. Look, as philosophers and as people who want to know the truth, right, I've used this image before, we're kind of in the dark. We're stumbling around in the dark to find some knowledge, like the pre-Socratics were, right? You could really see it in that case. We're sort of in the dark about the nature of reality, and we're stumbling around trying to find it. Well, what if somebody finds there's a light on over there where you can see things very clearly? Then you might say, okay, well, everybody, let's go over there to find out what's going on in that area where we can see things very clearly. Right? That's sort of what science was doing at this time. Oh, look, there's this whole area that we can focus on: extension, size, location, moving, that we can measure very easily and actually quantify and make predictions and get all sorts of results. And that's been the success story of science. Is that because it's the best way and the only way to know about the world, as sometimes people seem to think? Or is it because, well, that's where the light is on. That's where it's easier to see what's going on, right? That's where it's easier to know. Does that mean that that's all there is to know? Not necessarily, right? So this is a question that's still with us today. The scope of scientific inquiry. How far can it go? Is it really just about those things, or can we also talk about color, sound, taste, smell, or not? Or are those things simply off limits? Now, if you know anything about modern psychology and neuroscience and things like that, you know that there is a science of color and sound and taste and smell, isn't there? not just of light waves like Descartes was doing, but the actual physiology of how it works. Yeah. Okay. Oh, I gotta hurry. What the heck? Okay, so that's John Locke. I'm not talking about everything he has to say, okay? For here, the main point is he takes a lot of what he thinks from Descartes, but he disagrees about the sources of knowledge. He does not think that any knowledge is innate. Rather, we get all knowledge through the senses. Okay. Okay, George Berkeley. Interesting person. Anybody already knows what's coming. So he was Irish. Sometimes I go into his biography a little bit more, but let's not do that because we have time related issues. Empiricist, obviously, that's why we're talking about it. But he is not just an empiricist. He is an extreme empiricist to the point of being an idealist. Okay? From the previous terminology, maybe you can tell what that's going to mean. Right? An empiricist just says all our knowledge about the world is through the senses. Right? And remember, the empiricist says our senses give us ideas of the world. Well, an idealist then is someone who thinks only those ideas are real. That's what Berkeley's going to argue. A difficult pill for people to swallow, but like the ontological argument that we looked at, Descartes' argument for God, it's difficult to actually disprove. He was a bishop, so he was also partially theologically motivated, I think, a little bit like Descartes, but probably did not care for Descartes' idea that the whole world out there is this materialistic world that we can study through science. To him, that was too materialistic, too much putting the world into these confines of that are amenable to scientific investigation. So you can see the way in which science and religion sometimes conflict. So for Berkeley, he was trying to push back against this materialism that was beginning to rise in scientific circles. And some scientists, unlike Descartes, some philosophers and scientists, like for example Bacon, they were full materialists. They were not dualists at all. So materialism itself, materialism as being the idea that everything is matter, right? That there's nothing left over. There's no immaterial soul, and even experiences that you have, you're having them as a physical being. So there just is matter. That's all there is. This view was gaining prominence, and the sciences were encouraging this, of course. Scientific inquiry was encouraging us to look at the entire world in this materialistic way. So George Berkeley was pushing back on that. So Berkeley is an idealist, so he's an empiricist, so he starts with this basic idea that Locke agrees with as well. So he's disagreeing with Descartes in that sense, just like Locke. He thinks all knowledge ultimately is derived from experience. He agrees that secondary qualities like sight and sound and sight and things like that, color, he agrees that those are secondary qualities and they're just in the mind. But he goes one step further and he says those primary qualities like extension and size and shape, those are also in the mind. Okay? So it's not just like this, like on Locke's view or Descartes' view. And now remember, Locke and Descartes were both theists. They both believed in God. So they would have believed that God first created that external objective world out there that's made of matter. God made this material world. That's for Locke and Descartes. And then we experience that material world in this indirect way. This material world gives us representations of it, like we see in this picture. God is, of course, causing the whole thing for both Descartes and Locke. Well, Berkeley believes in God as well, and he agrees that when we have a representation of a fire hydrant or a tree, he agrees that it's all in your mind, but he thinks that there's just no reason to suppose that there's a material object out there in addition to your representation. It's just not necessary. You can simplify. If God is already part of the equation, if God is already the person that's behind all of your reality, then why suppose that there's some sort of material thing out there apart from your experience? For one thing, you would never know that it's there because all you ever know is your experience. And so at that point, it just becomes, if you're an empiricist, doesn't it just follow logically that you cannot say that you know that external objects exist? If all knowledge derives from experience, and all your experience ever gives you is these representations, but not external objects themselves, then you simply cannot conclude that these external objects exist. It would just be a gratuitous metaphysical speculation. It's like saying, well, maybe fairies exist, right? Or maybe the flying spaghetti monster exists in some other dimension, but we can't ever verify it, right? Because how would you ever know that external objects exist if all you know is that you have these internal ideas? You see what's happening here? So that already is an attack on this idea of material reality existing independently on its own out there as an objective reality. No, it does not. Now, that's not to say that your experiences are not real, right? This everyday experience that you're having, Berkeley insists it is real. He wants to be a common sense philosopher, believe it or not. Berkeley really thinks that what he's saying is kind of common sense, and the materialists who are saying that there's these material objects out there, but we can't directly perceive them, he thinks that that's kind of nonsense. He thinks, no, your everyday experience is real, but it's caused directly by God. You know, God causes you to have experiences, and God can sort of keep everyone's reality somewhat consistent, right? And God is the writer of the matrix. He puts everyone in the same matrix, but there's just no reason to suppose that there's a middleman between God and your ideas, between God and your experiences. Now, so you see how this also makes everyday experience much more spiritual seeming as well. So rather than your everyday experience being an interaction with these colorless, odorless objects, that's really what they are, pure just matter extended in space. No, your everyday experience is a direct experience of God, right? So it gets away from this sort of cold materialism that was beginning to rise in the scientific revolution and among the other empiricists. For Berkeley, no matter, material stuff out there, extension, that's a made-up concept. There's no such thing as matter for Berkeley. That's just a concept that philosophers made up. All you know, you have experiences. And you know that God is responsible for everything. So why postulate this whole extra thing that you can't actually have empirical access to? You can't actually experience those objects out there in the world directly. Right? That's the empiricist idea. That's representationalism. But Berkeley goes further and says these representations don't represent some physical object out there. These representations are put directly into your mind by God. Right? Another argument against matter is that it's just an empty abstraction. This idea of matter, extended stuff out there, is just something that philosophers came up with. It's not a real thing. So Berkeley, unlike Locke, is not a conceptualist. Okay, now what does that mean? Well, remember universals? Remember when we looked at Plato? We had this idea, there's an individual cat here, an individual cat there, an individual cat there. To know what a cat is, you have to grasp what they all have in common, their essence, the universal cats. To know what white is, you have to know the universal whites. Right, so we tend to think, yeah, we've got these general concepts. I have a general concept of a triangle that allows me to recognize individual triangles. I have a general idea of a cat that allows me to recognize individual instances of cats, and so on. Excuse me. that sounds kind of right. And Plato went really crazy with that, right? He thought that those universals actually existed out there in the world, out there in objective reality. But we saw in Locke, well, you would see if you read him, that there's no Platonic forms like that. They're just mental concepts. That's a little bit more common sense, isn't it? Yeah, you've got a mental concept of a triangle in your head. You've got a general idea of a triangle, or a general idea of what makes something have a color, what a color is. That sounds kind of common sense and good, but Berkeley says that do you really have a general idea of a triangle? What's your general idea of a triangle? When you think about a triangle, you're going to imagine some specific triangle. You will only ever be able to imagine a particular. You don't actually grasp any kind of general triangle when you really look at the psychology of it. Try to think of an abstract triangle without any particular angles, without any particular size or shape. Just a general one, right? That's what we're supposed to be able to do, right? We're supposed to be able to escape the particulars. That's what Plato thought of it. To grasp the essence, to grasp what they all have in common. You can say it in words, but you don't actually have a concept that you can latch onto that's a general triangle. It's always going to be some particular triangle, some particular color, some particular cat that you imagine when you imagine the archetypical cat. It is still going to be some sort of particular. So you only ever grasp particulars. So we don't have a general concept of matter, therefore, right? All you can really do is imagine an object that looks a certain way. A general circle, maybe, but what size is it? Maybe it doesn't have, maybe that's just it, right? In your mind, without a second thing to compare it to, maybe there is no specific circle. So this might be a counterexample. I don't know. There's a lot of different ways, different angles that you can take on this problem of universals versus particulars. What kind of reality the universals have, whether they have this formal reality like in Plato, whether it's purely conceptual, like it's in your head, or what's called nominalism. We just have a word. We just have a word triangle that attaches to individual triangles, but we don't have a general concept. So I don't know. A general circle might be a counterexample. It's interesting, yeah. Yeah, if it's only defined by its shape, can size matter? Yeah. Yeah, interesting to think about. Not sure what Berkeley would say. Yeah. I mean, this is not the main thrust of his argument anyway. Right. So what you're supposed to think about is when you think about matter, right? This supposed to be the underlying stuff, right? That's underlying everything, right? So this is the picture that we're getting in the scientific revolution that still is with us today in many ways. And it doesn't matter what physical object you're looking at; they're all made of matter. What's matter? Extended stuff, right? And extended stuff does not have color or smells or anything like that, right? It's that kind of cold world, that mathematical world that science studies. But Berkeley says, well, look, you can't actually think of matter as just this extended stuff. Try to imagine something extended without any particular color. Cannot do it. Like I said, I represented it, the fire hydrant, as a gray fire hydrant, but that counts as a secondary quality. That visual experience of grayness is something caused by the purely physical structure out there. Right? So can you imagine matter as a general thing underlying everything without any particular secondary qualities? No, you cannot. The visual part is always going to be part of it. You cannot imagine matter in general without any kind of secondary quality. So that means that this idea of matter is a pure abstraction. It has no bearing on reality, says Berkeley. It's moving on. Let me fix this for a second here. Not that one. Nope. Where am I trying to go to? I want to go to the Prezi. There we go. Okay, I needed that bottom to show up. Transparency, a lack of color. Well, I mean, it's again, are you imagining a transparent object? Right, but can you actually apprehend that mentally? Can you actually think of an invisible gas with a particular shape? I think Berkeley will say you can never imagine something extended without, yeah, like something to compare it to. So you can't imagine pure extension. Everything you think always has these secondary qualities to them. And so for Berkeley, that means if you're an empiricist, and in your experience, you can never go beyond the secondary qualities. Yeah, exactly. In some sort of environment, yeah. So your experience is always going to be colored by those secondary qualities, things like vision and sound, sight, smell, hearing, all those things. You can't imagine any object at all without any of those properties. So to say that the very nature of reality is this extended stuff that has none of those properties, well, you can see that that's a problem for an empiricist then, isn't it? Empiricists insist that all knowledge is derived from experience, yet we never have experience of some sort of colorless, odorless, soundless stuff. We never have experience of matter. Matter, this idea that philosophers have come up with, people like Descartes and Locke and strict materialists like Bacon and Hobbes, well, they're being bad empiricists. They're going beyond what the senses actually tell them. Their senses tell them that things in the world have these secondary properties, right? But secondary qualities, just like primary qualities or properties, however you want to call them. Sometimes you call them qualities, properties, it doesn't matter. They're all just in your head. You're just having an experience of them, right? So matter is already an empty abstraction. But then also to suppose that matter has this extra existence beyond our own minds, well, you can't ever verify that, can you? Right? So again, if you're a strict empiricist, this idea, this thing that we learn when we're children, object permanence, right? Where you see the little choo-choo train going through a tunnel, and small children will think, oh, it's disappeared, this is gone forever. You get a little older and you realize, look at the other side of the tunnel, it's going to come out any second. Now, of course, if you're a strict empiricist, you can't say that you know that the train is inside the tunnel when it's out of view. All knowledge derives from experience. You're not experiencing that hidden train, right? So you can't really say that you know it exists. In the same way, you might say, well, matter is always hidden out of view. You can't ever access matter directly because we always have to contend with these secondary properties. How would you measure an object, right? If you wanted to get down to those primary qualities to measure how big something is, you have to use the secondary qualities as a guide, right? The secondary qualities are what we are familiar with first of all, right? We see the object and we can feel it, and we can feel its contours with our sensory data, with our tactile senses, and then our brain is able to combine that really well with our visual ideas, right? And then we're able to measure it using measurement devices, and we can do science. But we need those secondary qualities to even get to those primary qualities. So for Berkeley, the primary qualities then are going to be primary, and we are just not justified in saying, well, the secondary qualities are in my mind, but the ones that I'm like getting to with my abstract arguments, these primary qualities supposedly that they supposedly have in their own selves, in their own right, exist out there independently of my mind. Berkeley says if you're an empiricist, you cannot conclude that. An empiricist cannot go beyond their senses. This concept of matter as something that exists outside of any particular sensation, nonsense, right? You just can't do it. It makes no sense. So the idea is nothing exists for Berkeley except for minds and ideas. Okay, so ideas and the kinds of things that can have ideas, namely minds. So the great big mind, of course, is God's mind, right? So your whole entire world that you experience, it's directly from God's mind to yours. His sort of slogan, right? Descartes had a slogan, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. Berkeley says, esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived. Right? For something to be real, for something to exist, is precisely for it to be perceived in some way. If you want to say that something exists unperceived, you're not being a good empiricist, right? As an empiricist says, all knowledge is derived through the senses. So if there's some idea that you're contemplating, but there's no way for you to verify it through your senses, then you don't know it, right? At the very least. Now that's the epistemological part. You think he'd stop there, right? You think he'd just say, well, then you can't know that that stuff exists. But he actually goes further. He actually says, no, if it's not perceived, then it doesn't exist at all. You know? Which itself, when I state the conclusion, I think many people will say, no, that can't be right? That everything's just an idea. There's no real objective world out there. Many people have that reaction. But at the same time, if you grant some of the premises like representationalism and empiricism, this idealism seems to follow logically from empiricism and representationalism. Empiricism being you can't ever know except through the senses, and representationalism being you only ever know these kind of representations of things, not things out there. What follows logically? Berkeley's idealism seems to follow logically from representationalism and empiricism, even though it sounds unbelievable. Now, you might want to say, well, what about the train example then? If Berkeley is supposed to be so common sense, like I use the train example as an illustration. That's not actually what Berkeley would say about the train example. When the train goes into the tunnel, we don't think it disappears, do we? Simply because we're not experiencing anymore. Right? So Berkeley wants to preserve our common sense intuitions about that. Right? So here's my hand. Now I'm putting it over here. I'm not seeing it. You're not seeing it. Does it still exist? We want to say yes. Right? That seems like a common sense thing to say. That's not like matter, which was a philosophically defined word that seemed to be an abstraction. You know, that's different. That's just completely made up and out of view and never verifiable. But a hand that comes and goes and it's just part of our everyday reality, we want to think, well, it does not actually just disappear completely out of existence every time we don't observe it, does it? Berkeley's solution for that is that, well, look, God is always watching. So there's a famous little limerick that was written about this. There was a young man who said, God must find it exceedingly odd to think that the tree should continue to be when there's no one about in the quad. Right, so that's the idea here is, well, that's really weird. If there's you go to the CR campus, when you go there, you see trees. Now in coronavirus, nobody's there checking out the trees. Did those trees disappear because no one's watching them? "Well, that sounds exceedingly odd, doesn't it? It sounds very strange." Berkeley's reply, imagined reply, right? Berkeley didn't write this little limerick, somebody else did, just to make fun of him. The reply is, "Dear sir, your astonishment's odd. I'm always about in the quad, and that's why the tree will continue to be, since observed by yours faithfully, God." Right? So God is always observing everything, so therefore it's always existing, right? Everything that exists. Not entirely satisfying, is it? 'Cause, well, I mean, what is God watching? Is it something that's actually there, right, independently? Or does this mean that every time my hand disappears out of view, God will make sure that he's having experience of the hand still? And so it still exists. Is that what it is? It sounds rather strange, doesn't it? Yeah. So Berkeley's a weird place to end up with. On the one hand, it seems to follow logically from this kind of extreme empiricism and representationalism. But at the same time, it's a strange place to end up in. The idea that there is no independent physical reality outside of your mind. There are just ideas, either in your mind or in God's mind. That's where he ends up. Normally, I spend a little more time, but I'm trying to go fast today. Okay. So, oh man, are we going to be able to get through all of Hume? Well, I'm going to keep going a little bit. As always, since it's time, you can go if you want, but I think I'd like to keep going a little bit so we don't get so behind. Okay. So Berkeley, plenty to think about there. See where he ends up, right? David Hume ends up similarly in a strange kind of position, but Hume is not this sort of religious person like Berkeley who really has an agenda. Hume is, when you read Hume, he's one of the more relatable thinkers from antiquity. He's more recognizably like us, I think. Well, you might not agree, but okay. So notice the date there, 1776, right? So he died the same year that America was founded, to give you a time of where he is in history. So he was a Scottish dude, and an empiricist, of course, but he was also a historian, and actually he became known as a historian before he became known as a philosopher. Okay, he wrote one of the first comprehensive histories of England, and also one of the first times history attempted to use some of the more scientific methodologies that were becoming popularized at the time. Because the scientific revolution, it was a lot about, physics, right? How objects move in space, how gravity works, how light works, and things like that. And also things like we saw human anatomy, right? Learning how bodies work and how they're all put together, learning how the actual globe, the world, the earth works. These were the usual kinds of things that we associate with science and the scientific revolution. But history itself was in a bad place before this as well, because a lot of history is very motivated by who's writing it at what time, and a lot of biases sneak their way into it. And ancient people were often not careful with their sources, so they would repeat a story that was just a story as though it's fact. So there's all these problems, and Hume is not free of those problems by any means, okay? His work is going to have the same kind of biases in there that he's trying to avoid, but at the very least, he's much more self-aware and conscientious, and is trying to do history in a more scientifically respectable way. In a more scientific way. So this book or series of books, his History of England, was very popular at the time, and for a long time that was the standard textbook that people used to learn about the history of England. So that itself is a hugely notable achievement, and nobody ever even talks about that, even though that's already super important. He also is one of the first people to look at religion, not in the sense that has happened in the past, right? Where we got a lot of people who are sort of established Christians who sort of assume the truth of their religion. Now, in the pre-Socratics, we saw, and in Plato, we saw some more subversive stuff, right? We saw Plato not afraid, or Socrates not afraid to sort of dig in at the establishment at the time about their religious beliefs. But that hadn't happened in a while. David Hume was one of the first people to really look at religion in a more scientific kind of way, to look at it as a human phenomenon, right? So that religion, you know, you got to understand, right? I understand that from each religious person's point of view, what they believe isn't really a religion, right? Everyone else believes in religion because a religion is just a system that doesn't necessarily refer to reality, but the religious person thinks that they have access to the truth about religious nature, right? But at the same time, you have to recognize that religions have cropped up all over the world at various times in different places with certain differences, but also certain similarities. So we can start looking at history in that way, in a more naturalized way, rather than trying to just find ways to justify your religion. Right? Hume is doing something different, and he's looking at religion as a natural phenomena that we can study in a scientific, or at least in a scientifically respectable way. This did not go over well with people at the time at all, okay? And this book, even though you'd think he was trying to do something humble and just, yeah, why not? Why can't we do, you know, now we would just call that anthropology even, right? Why can't we just look at something that is a part of the natural world? People do have religions. They don't all agree with the nature of reality, but there is this phenomena, religion, that involves all sorts of things like holy books and rituals and community and moral standards. There are general features that religions have regardless of what the religion is. Different religions have these features. Right? So why not study them? Right? But this did not go over well. People did not like this kind of detached clinical look at the phenomena of religion, and this book ensured that David Hume would never have a teaching post. Right? Even though he was already this established person who had written on history and who had written lots of other philosophical things, because of this book, he was not able to have any kind of teaching post. Right? So he got kind of in trouble for it. Right? What we're going to look at is his treatise of human nature. And also, the main thing actually is the inquiry concerning human understanding, which is part of that second book that I listed right there. Right, it says essays and treatises. If you scroll down, it says an inquiry concerning human understanding. It's this famous work. A treatise of human nature delves into some similar territory. So I'm mining both to get a quick general overview. So Hume is like Locke and Berkeley, right? He's interested in how human beings acquire beliefs. How do we acquire knowledge about reality? And he has a theory of ideas, kind of reminiscent of Locke, but it's slightly different the way he does it. Hume divides ideas. Remember, ideas is anything that you can have in your mind, right? Any kind of occurrence in the mind, whether it's a perception, a thought, or a memory, right? Something that you imagine. Hume divides ideas into two basic categories: impressions and thoughts. So as usual, he's going to use these terms as technical terms, not the way you necessarily always mean them. Impressions are just immediate sensory experience. Impressions. It kind of makes sense, right? You make an impression on your hand and you feel it. Right? Light waves are making an impression on the back of my eyeballs. Right? Sound waves are impressing onto my eardrums. Right? So we get these immediate impressions, and these are moment by moment. Right? Whatever you're feeling right now, whatever you're seeing right now, that's an impression. So you're constantly having this constant flow of all sorts of impressions going on. Right? These are immediate. Whereas thoughts He reserves the word thought for things like remembering and imagining, right? Things where you're referring to some sort of impression, but in a secondary way. Right? So you can see that impressions are more what he calls lively and forcible. That makes sense, right? Your immediate impressions that are going on have a certain presence to you that's very vivid, that's different from just thinking about it, right? So if you pinch yourself, I feel it in the moment. It's lively and forcible. Now I'm just thinking about what that felt like. Oh, that's not so bad. Right? Thinking about it is slightly different from having the pain. Yeah. Or being in Disneyland versus imagining that you're in Disneyland, right? So I've been to Disneyland. Actually being there is different from me just thinking about it, right? It's pretty straightforward distinction, I think, right? But a lot of times to get the ball rolling on any kind of project, you have to start just making these distinctions, right? And this is how science is usually born, is to make these kind of distinctions, and then you can start doing empirical work with them. Right, so we've got impressions, these sort of primary ways in which we get information, and then later on we can think about those impressions in various ways. All right. Okay, I'm not going to read all that. It's just a quote basically saying what I said, but I don't want to linger on that too long. So Hume's empiricism is just impressions. Right, just to narrow it down, impressions are the source of all our ideas. Right, so Locke kind of had this word idea for everything, right? But then he said it's kind of a little bit muddled, and Hume is making it a little bit more specific. Right, the kinds of experiences that are the ultimate source for everything are these primary experiences, these impressions that you have moment by moment. That's the impression. That's the source of all your ideas. So then Locke takes this atomism that Locke had, right? Where you start with basic ideas and then you can combine them or make them more complex and abstract. Right? So we can create complex ideas out of simple ideas. And those simple ideas are always going to be traced back to some sort of simple, immediate sensory experience. But we can create all sorts of new ideas by taking our old ones and doing stuff to them. We can transpose different elements. We can augment. We can diminish things. Right? So, like transposing means you take two different concepts. Right? So I imagine I can think of human beings who talk, and I could think of a cat that meows. I could simply switch those and say, oh, now I thought of a human who meows and a cat who talks. And this is a great source for storytelling, isn't it? It's a great source for coming up with entertaining stories to tell one another. Just in your imagination, you can combine all the elements that are there in various different ways and come up with new ideas. Right? And so this is interesting in its own right, but he maybe partly is pushing back on Descartes, who was so confident that because he thought of the idea of God, that God must exist. But if you take this approach, you can see that it's kind of simple that, all those properties that God has, we're just imagining basic human properties, but to the nth degree. We're simply augmenting them, right? In the same way that Superman is just a human being with superpowers, and then we've transposed this other property of being able to fly. Now we have this being who's like a super being, but it can also fly. God, in all his perfections, he's omniscient, he's all-knowing, right? Well, humans know stuff. So perhaps all we've done is taken our ordinary concept of knowledge and then imagine, what if something had that to the infinite degree? Right? What if someone had all knowledge? Right? Or omnibenevolence, right? Human beings can do good things. We can do benevolent things. In your imagination, you could simply imagine, what if there's a being who always did what was right and who always did the best thing? So this is showing that it's actually quite easy to come up with an idea, even when it has no source in reality, or even when it has no correspondence in reality, right? It's got a source, it's got all these disparate elements that you're putting together and then augmenting in your imagination. Now, this is not to say that Hume is saying that God is imaginary. I'm not saying that. Hume does talk about the existence of God and the arguments for that. He's never quite, he's a little bit cagey about where he's at. Now, he was willing to discuss the possibility that God does not exist. And that itself, again, that's not something that endeared him to many of his contemporaries, right? But he nowhere argues that God doesn't exist or God is imaginary. But at the same time, you can see how with these tools at your disposal, this way of explaining where ideas come from, Descartes simply thought that nothing else could have caused the idea of God except God himself. Now here Hume is showing a plausible alternative, which is simply that we've taken certain basic human elements and then imagined them to an infinite degree, all in one being. That's one way that you could come up with the concept of God, right? By simply taking what you already know and putting it together in an imaginative way. What's really important here is Hume distinguishes between two kinds of knowledge that we can have. This should sound familiar to you when I explain it, because it's basically just the difference between analytic and synthetic that we talked about. Right? He calls them relations of ideas and matters of facts. So relations of ideas, it's just these things that we talked about, analytic statements, basically. Right? If A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, then A is bigger than C. Yeah, that has to be true, right? 3 times 2 is 6, that has to be true, right? These are analytic truths, what he calls relations of ideas, right? Where we're just sort of looking at the different relationships between ideas and asserting what they are, right? What is the relationship between 3 and 6? Well, 2 of those equal it. Right? We're just spelling out how these things are related to one another. Right? So we've called that analytic. Sometimes I say they're definitional truths, maybe, right? Versus matters of fact, right? Where it's ampulative. We're going beyond just what the concept says, right? So the coffee woke me up, for example. You can't get that just by analyzing the concept of coffee, right? Sometimes a cup of coffee doesn't wake you up, right? So that's what makes it synthetic. It's not something that's already contained within the concept of coffee. We're going beyond that. Right? So matters of fact are like that. So matters of fact are mostly going to be statements about the nature of the external world. Right? And then you have relations of ideas. So with those two kinds of knowledge, and he's going to say that that's it. Those are all the kinds of knowledge you can have, right? So the idea is you get some basic impressions. Those impressions lead to simple ideas. You can combine simple ideas in various ways, make them complex, augment them in various ways, do all sorts of stuff. And then you can trace out the relationship between all these ideas, right? And some of these ideas might be ideas about numbers or ideas about triangles. But you first got those ideas from your impressions. So then you can go ahead and trace out the relationships between these ideas. Those are all your analytic truths. And you can focus on the ideas themselves, the ideas that we have about the external world based on our impressions. And that we can do that with science or just your everyday experience. So what Hume is suggesting then, to put it in terms of being meaningful. Now, Hume did not necessarily put it in this way, but I'm putting it in this way because this is going to come up again later. Okay, so I'm going to put it in this way. It does not matter much for us now how we put it, but this is one way to put it. So if that's true, if there's only two kinds of knowledge, if there's only two kinds of ways that something can be true, it's either analytically true because of this definitional thing, or we're tracing the relationships among ideas, or something is true because it's something that we can verify empirically. This leads to this criterion of meaning, right? So the idea is that for any kind of true-false statement, it's got to be either an analytic statement that's true or false by definition, or a synthetic statement that we could empirically verify. Empirically verify means check it out for yourself, like with the senses, right? So I say in principle because look, I could say something like, I think there's aliens on Jupiter. I can't actually go check that, but it's a meaningful statement because we understand what it would be like to verify that, right? That's in principle empirically verifiable. I can't actually go to Jupiter to make sure of that, but what I said was a meaningful thing to say. We don't know if it's true or false, right? But it's meaningful, right? Whereas if I said something like, the dream glowed aggressively in the key of 13. I just made that up. That's nonsense, right? It's not an analytic statement. It's not something that's verifiable. Yeah, it's deep. A lot of that's going to be the point of Hume, and a lot of people after who like Hume think that the history of philosophy is riddled with nonsense statements. Okay, this is where the empiricist criterion of meaning is pretty brutal because it means that anything that's not in principle empirically verifiable or something that's just a matter of logic or math is going to be nonsense, right? So it's a test of meaningfulness. It's not a test of whether it's true or false. It's a test of, is the statement even meaningful? So a lot of poetry, for example, poetry is great and it can do all sorts of interesting to you psychologically, but poetry is not meant to be like science or math. Poetry is supposed to give you some sort of experience, but you don't need to ask if it's literally true or false, because you can't verify the truth or falsehood of a poem, right? That's not the right way to analyze a poem. It's not, does it represent the world accurately? It's not like that. Now, you might want to argue against that, okay? That I'm just saying this is one way to look at it. Right? If something's not even in principle empirically verifiable, and it's not just an analytic statement or a definitional truth, then it's going to be just nonsense, according to Hume. Right? If you're going to say that something is true, then if you're making a meaningful, intelligible statement, you should be able to show that it's true by definition, or a mathematical truth or something like that, right? These analytic truths, or because our sensory experience tells us, verifies directly that this is true. And you could do that in a very sort of complicated, abstract way like we do in science, right? A lot of scientific experiments aren't just like, oh, look at that, right there, that verifies it. No, a lot of times it's over time and lots of different experiments, you know, like that. But that would still count as empirically verifiable. So Hume has this challenge. He sets up this huge challenge. It's called Hume's fork. This is a fork with two prongs. So his test is, so he's saying, if we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, what he means by this is all the medieval writings by the theologians and the Aristotelian scientists. Okay, school metaphysics refers to Aristotelian type science, which was not very scientific, again, because they wanted to just take Aristotle at his word and say Aristotle was right about everything. I'm simplifying things, but that's what he's talking about, right? He's pushing back against this old way of doing things. Right? So he says, okay, take one of these books that those medieval people wrote, a book of theology or a book of Aristotelian science, and then ask yourself, is this abstract reasoning about quantity or number? Right? Is this math and geometry stuff? No? Okay. Can you do some sort of experimental reasoning about this? Because it's some sort of fact about the world outside of us that we can verify? No? Then throw it in the fire. It's a very forceful point. Just chuck it. It's nonsense. It can be nothing but sophistry and illusion. Remember sophistry, the sophists, right? It's a bunch of hot air Much Ado About Nothing, right? A lot of the history of philosophy, Hume is saying, is people making a bunch of claims that you can't verify empirically and you cannot prove them mathematically, and yet they are saying that this is knowledge. Hume says, no, right? No, we cannot do that. You've taken for granted way too much. Right? You've taken for granted this whole idea of causation, for example. Causal statements that we find in science are actually not necessary. They're contingent. It's really weird when you think about it. But I mean, think about one of Newton's equations that tell us, given this trajectory and this mass of the ball and this much force, where will it go? Right? We can predict, right? Can't we? We can use that formula to predict where it's going to go. Yeah. We assume that we can every time. We assume that this is going to hold in the future. This statement, this formula that allows us to predict what is going to happen to a ball if we throw it with this much force. But those causal statements themselves are not actually necessary, and they're actually not verifiable empirically, because they say that in the future this will hold true as well. Right? These formulas say, if you throw the ball like this, then it'll go right there with that much speed, etc. It's a prediction about the future. But of course, we have not observed the future. All we know is that formula has worked in the past. You don't know on the basis of experience that it'll work in the future, because you have not yet experienced it. Right? So to make it more concrete, strictly speaking, look, okay, if I drop this, I don't have to be Newton. I'll make a prediction. It's going to fall. Okay, I was right. Now, I'm assuming that the future is going to resemble things that happened in the past. So when I do it again, I'll assume the same thing. It's going to fall. That's based on my previous experience. Okay, it did it again. Okay, I verified that it did. But about the future, I will not know. Not with certainty, right? So again, do I know that it's going to fall? Well, I mean, I think I do. I certainly expect it to. But I'm just basing that on my previous experience. I have not yet experienced what's going to happen. So if you're an empiricist, you have to say that these causal statements, especially the ones that we're finding in science, they're actually not these truths that the philosophers had been after, these necessary kinds of truths, right? And in fact, our assumption that Newton's equations hold true universally is only an assumption. How do we know that Newton's equations will work tomorrow? How did they know that Newton's equations would guide the rockets to the moon accurately? How did they know that? Right? If you're an empiricist, it's hard to say that you ever know it. So this is just Hume being skeptical, right? So he's a skeptical empiricist. He's not going to say that therefore we should toss out Newton's equations. He's just saying, if you're being honest, you don't know that they're always going to be true. You don't know that these are necessary truths that we're discovering, right? If it's about knowledge, and epistemology is about what you know, and philosophers are after knowing the truth, right? So Hume is just going to say, with things like causation, it's not an analytic truth. You know, when you look at those equations, they're not analytically true, although maybe they are, but in some weird way. But for Hume's point is that at the very least, you cannot know that it will give you the right results in the future. Even if there's no reason to think that it won't, we don't need to then disregard science or causal statements or causality. It's simply we cannot justify the assumption that underlies it. Right? This assumption that the future will resemble the past. This underlies all our scientific reasoning, but it's an assumption that we cannot justify using scientific reasoning, because scientific reasoning assumes it, right? Yeah. So that's one. Okay, yeah, there we go. This is I'm not going to look at that right now. Hurry along. I already made the point in that little box, so I don't have to say it again. That's just one object of skepticism. And again, what we're trying to do here is we're applying this empiricist criterion of meaning, right? So in the first case, it's this idea, oh, Newton's equations give us absolute truth of necessary things, give us the absolute knowledge of necessary truths. Well, no, because the very foundation of scientific reasoning is this assumption that the future will resemble the past, this idea that causes somehow logically entail their effects, but they do not. And it's not justifiable on empirical grounds, and it's not justifiable on analytic grounds. So it's just not something you actually know. It's rather there's an assumption that you have to make. You can't get around it. The idea of a substance is like that as well. The idea that there's some sort of, what all the pre-Socratics were after, what Aristotle talked about, what Descartes talked about. This idea that, we have these objects, and yes, that has all these properties that we notice, these what we call secondary properties, right? We see that it has a certain color to it, and the color then allows me to pick it out from the background so that I can see that it looks this big compared to that. I can see the colors and the smells and all that. So there's some sort of, it's natural for us to assume that there's something there that has those properties, right? Yeah, the cup. The cup has these properties of looking like this, having this shape, smelling like this, sounding like this. There's some sort of underlying bearer of the properties. Intuitively, that seems to make sense, right? We looked at Descartes' example of the piece of wax, where all the visual properties are changing, and even all the auditory and what's related to smelling? I keep wanting to think olfactory, but that's the whole system, having to do with sense and smells. Right? So the wax changes from moment one to moment two. All the visual properties have changed, and yet we somehow think it's the same underlying thing, right? Or an ice cube that melts, right? Oh, that puddle there used to be an ice cube. It's the same stuff, the same underlying reality that underlies these changing visual experiences, right? That's why the pre-Socratics were after the arche, this underlying reality. Some philosophers like Descartes identified this with matter, right? Descartes thought, well, it's the underlying stuff is just purely extended things. But Hume is skeptical about that as well. All right. Well, why? Well, suppose I were to say there's some sort of underlying substance that is the bearer of all the properties that the cup has, or there's some sort of underlying wax stuff, right, that explains why we have these visual phenomena. But that's not an analytic statement, and there's also no sensory experience that can verify it. Because again, we're saying, oh, if I notice all these different properties with my senses and they're changing, there must be some underlying substance. But do we ever observe that underlying substance? No. All we observe are those properties that it induces in us. Right? So it's a little bit like the Berkeley thing, right? Berkeley also saying, well, look, all you experience is your experiences. And if you think that all knowledge begins with experience, then that means you can't actually know that there's something out there beyond the perceptions that you're having. Right? Now, Hume is not like Berkeley. Hume is much more likely to say that all this stuff that I'm questioning here, these are things that as human beings you have to do. We naturally do them. Right? We naturally assume that there's some stuff out there that's independent of my mind. We naturally assume that the piece of wax is the same substance even though all the properties have changed. these are natural assumptions, and he does not say, therefore, we should get rid of them. He's simply saying, well, according to the empiricist criterion of meaning, or according to empiricism, we can't actually know those things. Right? To know that there's some sort of underlying substance, you'd have to be able to get past the properties that we actually experience. But we cannot, says Hume and the other empiricists, get beyond the experiences that we have. He turns this skepticism towards the self even, which is crazy when you think about Descartes, thinking that the self is the most certain thing ever, right, that he builds on. It's interesting to think about that Descartes was just like, souls exist, God exists, I have proved it mathematically and scientifically. Done, right? And then Hume comes along and says, that's not so simple, buddy. The self, for example, this actually fails the empiricist criterion of meaning as well. Hume thinks to himself, okay, let me use my inner sense, you know what Locke talked about. Let me just sink within myself, close my eyes, and see if I notice a self anywhere. Is there a self? No, I'm feeling a twinge in my stomach. I just thought I should end class soon. I feel a little itch right here. I'm having all these experiences, and I'm saying I'm having these experiences. Sure, my language forces me to use that kind of language or that kind of terminology. But if I'm actually being an empiricist, do I actually notice a self within my mind? All I notice, says Hume anyway, is a stream of experiences coming and going. And so the analogy that you might use is, well, yeah, when you look at a waterfall, right, and you look at the flowing water, do you insist that something must have the flowing water? That there's a separate entity called the waterfall that has the flowing water? Or do we simply say the waterfall just is the flowing water? Right? There's nothing beyond that. There isn't some other entity that has the flowing of the water. No, a waterfall just is flowing water. Right? So in this view, a self isn't anything apart from that stream of experiences. What you call a self, yourself, is just a convenient way of thinking about your experiences and putting them all together. But on this view, there's no empirical verification for the self. You can't observe the self. Again, you can observe your body, but that's not the self that people like Descartes were talking about, right? This immaterial soul. You can't look within your mind and find an immaterial soul. All you will ever find, empirically speaking, is experiences. But again, that's not to say that you should not think of yourself as a self. Hume is simply saying that however natural it feels to posit some sort of separate entity, it is not actually justifiable empirically or analytically, right, or mathematically or anything like that. Almost done here. So the self also fails this criterion of meaning. It turns out that things like causation, substance, the self, these things that had been touted as great examples of things that we can really know about, and in some cases know about a priori, Hume is saying, no, you don't actually know any of that stuff. And the external world, right? Again, Berkeley went as far as to deny the very existence of the external world. Hume does not go that far. He's simply saying we don't have knowledge of this. We don't know it in the way that philosophers had been hoping to have knowledge, right? Absolutely certain knowledge of necessary truths. Right? The existence of the external world, sorry to tell you, sorry to break it to you, you cannot know about that a priori, you don't have certain knowledge of it, and it's not necessary knowledge, right? So we just don't know that this external world exists. At least we don't. It's not a philosophically respectable. Respectable. That's not a difficult word. I don't know why I stumbled over it. You just can't assert that you know all these things the way that philosophers have been doing. Right? Philosophers were very quick to claim knowledge. Right? So it's Socrates' revenge, if you want to call it that. Right? Here comes Hume pointing out all the examples of where philosophers thought they knew something, but they didn't actually know something. Right? Particular things like the idea of a substance or a self. I mean, these are foundational concepts for someone like Descartes, who thought, again, cool guy, but sometimes I imagine him being sort of a Poindexter type, right? Who says, here are my beliefs and I have proved them scientifically, right? And just assumes that he's figured out the universal truth for everyone, and he figured it out a priori using pure reasoning because he's so smart and he figured everything out, right? And Hume is saying, not so quick, everybody. You've been way too quick to assume that you can just know things a priori with absolute certainty. When, in fact, if you really think about the way that we acquire knowledge through our sensory experience and by thinking about our sensory experience, right? Developing ways of comparing our ideas and analyzing them. And out of that comes math and geometry and science. That's how you get knowledge. These other things that we're talking about in philosophy are not like that. Right? So it becomes a challenge. It becomes a big question, right? So I'll leave you with this. Hume is saying that knowledge is either going to be analytic and a priori or synthetic and a posteriori. Right? So we got math and geometry, which of course, they developed alongside and out of the philosophical search for knowledge. And so does empirical science, right? They all have their source in philosophy. If you look at it historically, I hope you've been able to see that. They have their origin historically in a general search for knowledge. But now, eventually, we got to a point where we are able to see that. And Hume saw that very clearly. Our best examples of knowledge are math and geometry, which are analytic, and empirical science, right? Our understanding how the natural world works by experimental reasoning, by scientific reasoning. Those are the two things that actually give us knowledge. So what is left then for philosophy and subfields of philosophy like theology, right? What happens to those if they're not analytic or empirical? Hume is going to say that anything else is then going to be nonsense, right? Throw it out, throw it into the trash, throw it into the fire, he says. Anything that does not fall into either of these two categories. So then the question is, well, what's left for philosophy to do then? Or for that matter, right, what's left in general for you as a person, right, thinking about this? Is that right? Right? What other kind of knowledge could there be? Right? Is there another type of knowledge that this is leaving out? Kant is going to suggest something. Immanuel Kant was shocked by Hume. Kant grew up on the rationalists, and Immanuel Kant was very much a rationalist kind of thinker. And then he read Hume, and it just threw him into an existential despair. He said, it awoke me out of my dogmatic slumbers. Because this is a challenge. It's a gauntlet. It's throwing down a gauntlet. Right? For philosophy in general, for some of the things that philosophers have said throughout the ages, and also for theology. Right? You imagine all the claims that people make about the nature of God. Imagine something like the doctrine of the Trinity, right? The traditional doctrine in Christianity, which says that God, although there is only one sovereign God, God is actually three persons in one. Three distinct personalities. Now, people don't talk a lot about the Trinity anymore because they get uncomfortable with it. But that's a part of Christianity that goes way back. It's not actually found in the Bible, by the way, Trinitarianism. It's implied by it, but it's not actually spelled out. It's not until the Catholic Church actually made it official. But a doctrine like that, the doctrine of the Trinity, that God is actually three persons in one. You don't know that analytically, right? You don't know that simply through experience. I mean, how would you? What would that be like, right? What would an experience of that be, right? And what kind of experiences would be involved? It's difficult to think of anything that would actually verify that empirically. Whether or not we can even in principle do it, it's difficult to even think what that would be like. Whereas, there's an alien on Jupiter, even though I can't verify that right now, we know what that would be like. Other claims are much more difficult to make sense out of in that way. Okay, so it's a challenge. So you think about it. What's left over for philosophy to do? Is that the end of philosophy? Now that we've invented math, geometry, and science, then we just let that take over, and philosophers, the rest of us, just retire if you're not doing that, right? But also, for you personally, the kinds of things that you believe, is it true that, or the things that you think do they all divide into either analytic a priori or synthetic a posteriori? Okay, so I'll leave you for you to think about. And we'll end right there. Thank you for sticking around till the end. For those who did, I always appreciate it. I hope you have a good weekend. Cheers.